Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name's Valeria Moots. I am one of the organizers of this conference. I am a fellow here at the Society of Fellows, and I also am a lecturer in the Slavic department at Columbia. And welcome to the conference. I'm so excited to see you here, to see our wonderful speakers, as well as those of you who are joining on Zoom, via Zoom. Thank you for coming. And first, I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the sponsors of this conference, the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Harriman Institute, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. I would also like to personally acknowledge and thank the many people who helped me at the Hyman Institute: Lindsay Schramm, Sylvia Gindek, Erin Fay, and Zivia Lichtenberg. I'm so grateful for your incredible help and hard work in coordinating this conference and ensuring that it happens and that it runs smoothly. Thank you. Of course, I would also like to thank Professor Mark Lipovetsky, who has very generously shared his time and offered his support and guidance and advice and help in organizing this conference. Thank you all. And finally, I thank all of our participants for coming here to share their research with us. Looking forward to your presentations and to the discussions that will follow. Okay, so let me say a couple of words about what this conference is to situate it, and I'll try to be relatively brief. So this conference examines the intersections of literary culture and the scientific study of society. Over the next 2 days, our speakers will explore this intersection from a wide range of perspectives, including literary culture's engagement with ethnography and cultural anthropology, with sociology and psychiatry, with the scientific inquiry into economy and into governance. This conference will take as its premise a notion that the literary fiction of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union and literary culture at large was fixated and at times even hyper-fixated on studying its publics, on laying bare the country's social hierarchies or its social ills. And the conference will approach this dialogue between literature and the sciences of society from two standpoints. First, it will focus on their reciprocal influences. So, what epistemic frameworks did literature offer to the emergent sciences of society, and what did it borrow? How did literary culture affect the science of society, and conversely, how did the social sciences shape literary tradition from the realist novel and modernist experiments to socialist realism and postmodern literature? How did it shape literary culture and the literary cultures, plural? What methodological, theoretical, and political approaches did both domains of knowledge share, and how did they diverge? What can we learn by examining the two in tandem, as building upon or at times contesting one another? And second, this conference will examine specifically the political implications of literary culture's involvement in the social science project. Our speakers will explore how and why literary culture aided emergent and established studies of society in making sense of its publics and polity. To what ends did such literature employ scientific methods, and what kinds of ideas about the people and the state did it popularize? What were the effects of literary intervention in the domain of social science, especially of its ventures into the studies of ethnic and racial diversity, linguistic and national identity, systems of governance, and economic hierarchies? So in probing these questions, Plotting Publics will seek to uncover a shared methodology of society between these two very different domains of knowledge. And it will aim to offer a framework for understanding how social, ethnic, racial, or national identities are formed and maintained throughout history. So I will stop here with this description, but I want to again thank all of the speakers who are here today. I am very much looking forward to the discussions, and thank you for joining.
Hello, everyone. My name is Venya Gushin. I'm a fourth year at the Slavic department at Columbia University, and I will be your chair for the first panel, Utopian Protocols. First up, we have Maya Vinokur joining us from New York University. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies. Her forthcoming book, Workflows, Stalinist Liquids in Russian Labor Culture with Cornell University Press, investigates the metaphor of flow as a central figure in Russian labor discourse since 1870. She has written on contemporary Russian politics and culture for the Jordan Center blog, which she edits, for the Los Angeles Review of Books, and for Foreign Policy. She is also a translator of Arkady and Boris Strugatsky's Lame Fate, Ugly Swans with Chicago Review Press. And today her talk is entitled God Builders Among the Godless, Gorky, Bogdanov, and Early Soviet Utopianism. Take it away, Maya.
Thank you so much. Am I appropriately, is the microphone happening the way it should? Okay, success. Actually, my book is, it's so forthcoming, it's already out. What I'm giving you is a kind of little excerpt from it, maybe a little précis. Thank you so much to Valeria, wherever you are, yes, for inviting me to this conference. I'm going to actually start my talk that promises to be on Gorky and Bogdanov with a much later and decidedly not utopian author, and that is the Gulag chronicler Varlam Shalamov. So in a 1965 essay called On the New Prose, he wrote, Russian humanist writers of the second half of the 19th century bear on their souls the great sin of human blood spilled under their banners in the 20th. All the terrorists were Tolstoyans and vegetarians, all the fanatics students of the Russian humanists. By 1971, Shalamov's invective had grown even sharper. It is highly symbolic that they sell Nikolai Chernyshevsky's selected works for 5 kopecks, thereby rescuing them from the Auschwitz of paper trash, he wrote. Chernyshevsky ended when a 100-year-old era discredited itself fully. Over a century separates what is to be done, Chernyshevsky's 1862 encomium to revolutionary socialism, from Shalamov's indictment of its Soviet variant. In that time, according to Shalamov, the Russian humanist writers had not only failed to imagine, but actively contributed to the horrors of the century that followed their own. This talk takes seriously, maybe tests a little bit, Shalamov's polemical assertion that pre-revolutionary utopianism set the stage for the crimes of Stalinism by considering 3 influential contributors to late 19th century social thought. The cosmist philosopher Nikolai Fyodorov, the future father of socialist realism, quote-unquote Maxim Gorky, and the science fiction writer, Marxist critic, and blood transfusion enthusiast Alexander Bogdanov. What unites these 3 figures, plus several others that I won't discuss today, but which you can read about in my book, is heightened attention to a question that had already preoccupied Chernyshevsky, basically how optimally to organize labor in order to transform the world and the human being with it. In what is to be done specifically in the second of Vera Pavlovna's 4 dreams, Chernyshevsky articulated this question in terms of energetic channeling. Using the metaphor of the improperly drained or stagnant field, he argued that a society's health depends on the proper circulation of vital energies, without which the body politic becomes phantasmic or putrid, even. As the historian Richard Steitz has shown, Russian thought in the decades around 1900 was rich in utopian dreams, many just as radical as those belonging to Chernyshevsky, who was a little bit earlier, or the 3 figures on my slide here. But these authors, and especially the God builders, Bogdanov and Gorky, are remarkable for their emphasis on the health-giving pruning or channeling of unruly human material, whether they conceptualize it as overgrown plants, misdirected liquids, or ungovernable energies. In conceiving of society and people in this way, these thinkers anticipated the future tenets of Stalinist culture so I claim. First, they advocated the rapid perfectibility of humankind, primarily through labor, rather than through prayer, revolution, or gradual societal reorganization. Second, they expressed this belief through the metaphor of energetics, specifically liquid energies in need of channeling. Third, these figures, with the possible exception of Bogdanov, placed responsibility for the transformation of self, society, and the universe almost entirely onto the individual, even in the context of compulsory collectivism. In what follows, I'll examine each thinker in turn, discussing the links among them and the way their philosophies were adapted and appropriated in Stalinism. The influence on Soviet culture of Marxists like Gorky and Bogdanov, who were already closely affiliated with one another and with Lenin by the early 1900s, is unsurprising. Even though Lenin repudiated Bogdanov's ideas and Gorky had to be wooed back to the Soviet Union after becoming disillusioned with the dictatorship of the proletariat. Fyodorov, on the other hand, was a staunch monarchist and Orthodox Christian who believed in permanent celibacy and actively avoided not only fame, but even collating and publishing his own works during his lifetime. Nonetheless, his work anticipates many features of the Stalinist conception of labor in the human being. The philosopher is best known for his project of universal cosmic resurrection, promulgated in a series of essays collectively known as the philosophy of the common task. Specifically, Fyodorov believed that humanity's mission was to physically reunite all particles of everyone who had ever lived and died on Earth, then to colonize other planets to accommodate this expanded version of humanity. Despite avoiding publicity during his life, Fyodorov shared his ideas with prominent contemporaries like Lev Tolstoy, with whom he met regularly in the 1880s and early 1890s. After Fyodorov's death in 1903, a small but dedicated following transmitted the common task into the 20th century and beyond, despite decades when Fyodorov's name could scarcely be mentioned in public. Besides Gorky and Bogdanov, who drew directly on Fyodorov's ideas during and after their God-building periods, Fyodorov was known to numerous Silver Age and early Soviet poets, artists, and composers. An important feature of Fyodorov's philosophy is its literal, scientistic, and embodied understanding of resurrection, which contrasted with, for instance, Tolstoy's more metaphorical resurrectionary concept. In the letter to the learned about the unlearned, the first section of what would become the philosophy of the common task, Fyodorov wrote, "All matter is the dust of our ancestors, and in the most minute of these particles we may find their traces." According to Fyodorov, and later the so-called father of Soviet rocketry and eugenicist thinker Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, every particle in the universe betrays its origins through some feature of its material form. Identifying these markers in order to reassemble everyone's ancestors for Fyodorov is the job of a unified global science dedicated to promoting the common task over purely scientific or commercial aims. Confronting what he saw as the intolerable injustice and debasement of his own time, Fyodorov developed an all-consuming sense of urgency. Although he wrote no public-facing pamphlets like Tolstoy's I Cannot Be Silent from 1908, the impassioned, repetitious tone of the philosophy of the common task makes clear the depth of his concern. Given the apparently compulsory nature of his projects, it might be tempting to class him as an authoritarian thinker, but the situation is more nuanced than this descriptor allows. True, he was an arch-reactionary who thought that instead of freeing the serfs, the Tsar should have insurfed the free, and that Tsar and Church together should spearhead the project of universal resurrection. Yet at the same time, as Irene Masing-Delitzsch reminds us, the philosopher did not believe in coercion, only in strong motivation. Fyodorov thought that people should join in the common task, not under duress, but because they see its palpable advantages over other salvation alternatives. Despite these ambiguities, his ideas, in modified and decontextualized but easily recognizable form, were readily exploited within Stalin's tyrannical statecraft. Fyodorov's true successors were not the self-declared biocosmists of the 1920s who rejected several crucial aspects of his theories. Instead, his philosophy flowed into mainstream Stalinist thought and practice through conduits like Gorky and Bogdanov, Anatoly Lunacharsky, the first commissar of Soviet Enlightenment, socialist realist writers like Nikolai Ostrovsky, Leonid Leonov, and Marietta Shaginian, and fellow travelers like Andrei Platonov and others. Fyodorov's intellectual legacy permeates, in particular, Gorky's critical writing and fiction, dovetailing with the author's interest in the science of energetics and his belief in the perfectibility of man through labor. Gorky was familiar with Fyodorov's works, referred to him directly and indirectly in his private and public writings, and corresponded with contemporary Fyodorov adherents. A qualified admirer of Fyodorov's ideas, he believed in the philosopher's project, that the philosopher's project needed some amendments to be practicable, as Irene Masing-Delitzsch writes. Being a materialist, Gorky noted in 1934, I can contemplate the struggle against death only as a practical task demanding experimental testing. By the 1930s, according to Mazangdalij, Gorky was pleased to note that Stalin had initiated exactly the kind of realistic, centralized, common task he himself had in mind. Gorky's adoption of Fyodorov-like themes is evident in early fictional works like his 1908 novel Confession, as well as in articles he published throughout the 2 decades that followed. Although he would eventually leave God-building behind, ultimately adopting views more in line with emerging Stalinist orthodoxy, Gorky retained his penchant for cosmism. In 1912, for instance, he wrote, every year, more and more thought energy accumulates in the world, and I'm convinced that this energy, which while possibly related to light or electricity has its own unique inherent qualities, will one day be able to affect things we cannot even imagine today. Fyodorov had conceived of electricity in similar terms, writing that, quote, electric current, which is capable of transmitting voices, movements, and so forth, cannot be incapable of transmitting muscular movements, physiological phenomena, and even psychic ones, assuming these have some physiological expression. Anticipating Lenin's 1920 statement that communism equals Soviet power plus the electrification of the entire country, Fyodorov concluded that electricity is the miraculous force that, like fire in our own day, will be in the hands of all when an electric candle burns in every village hut. Traces of Fyodorov's work persist even where Gorky doesn't mention the philosopher by name. To the mechanical citizens of the USSR, an article published in Pravda on October 7th, 1928, just 6 days after the official launch of Stalin's first 5-year plan, railed against the so-called mechanical citizens who automatically became part of the USSR as inhabitants of formerly imperial territories, but who are not ideologically aligned with the Bolshevik state. Presumably, their antipode are the organic Soviet citizens whose heart and soul belong to the project of building socialism. Gorky also occasionally referred to Fyodorov explicitly, for instance, in More on Mechanical Citizens, which ran in Pravda on November 27, 1928. This article, a sequel to Gorky's initial salvo against ideological dissenters, contains an entire paragraph on Fyodorov, which I will quote to you here. We once had a wonderful thinker, relatively unknown because idiosyncratic, N.F. Fyodorov. Among his many original speculations and aphorisms is the following. Freedom without dominion over nature is the same as liberating the serfs but not giving them land. To my mind, this is irrefutable. The capitalistic order strives for control over the forces of nature exclusively in order to strengthen their power over the source of life force, over the physical power of the laboring people. Soviet government by workers and peasants sets itself a different goal, to process as much of the physical power of workers and peasants into a reason-based intellectual force, and by means of this force accelerate the subordination of all the energies of nature to the interests of the laboring masses, liberating them from meaningless forced labor on behalf of capitalists. This passage strategically reappropriates some of Fyodorov's most prominent ideas, adapting them to match political priorities at a crucial inflection point in early Soviet history. Even Gorky's language recalls Fyodorov's, though only as a distant echo. Fyodorov, too, decried the use of penal or forced labor to serve capitalistic goals, even though his condemnation was part of a broader indictment of revolutionary socialism. Gorky's reference to the physical power of workers anticipates the high Stalinist biopolitics that, like its Western counterparts, exploited the susceptibility of bare life to governmental intervention. Here and elsewhere, Gorky's borrowings from Fyodorov distorted the philosopher's original ideas, arriving at conclusions Fyodorov himself would never have endorsed. When it came to work, for instance, Fyodorov believed that the demand, quote, the demand for general comfort at the cost of forced labor, even if equally distributed, represents something anomalous. Meanwhile, for Gorky, the liberation of the laboring masses from capitalist forced labor and the attendant regulation of nature was a good in itself rather than a means to Fyodorov's preferred end of universal brotherhood. Because his highest aspiration was not Fyodorov-style salvation, but a subordination of nature to the goals of the Soviet state, Gorky did not see coercion as inherently problematic. Citing Fyodorov's belief in regulating nature, while eliding his negative attitude toward the emancipation of the serfs, Gorky conflated the energies of politics, nature, and human beings. The reference to acceleration reflects the frenetic tempo of the first 5-year plan that the first 5-year plan had already assumed, while the mention of reason is rapidly overshadowed by the irrational megalomania of the following clause with its mention of all the energies of nature. Like Fyodorov, Gorky abandons the notion of individual freedom, referring to laboring masses to be processed, presumably as human raw material, to serve a political order that claims to act in their name. The work of Gorky's fellow God builder, Bogdanov, was also suffused with Fyodorov-like themes, which, like Gorky, Bogdanov adapted to serve his own vision. The two thinkers had first become close around 1907, 1908, as Gorky was publishing Confession. At the time, Bogdanov was working on his own novel, the science fiction tale Red Star, the first installment in a planned trilogy. Red Star is the story of Leonid, a Marxist activist recruited to travel to Mars by many, a member of his revolutionary cell. Leonid finds the red planet by turns alienating and tantalizing, its inhabitants living in perfect socialist harmony amid disconcerting red foliage and ample opportunities for state-assisted suicide. Centuries ahead of their Earthling counterparts in terms of social, political, emotional, and economic organization, the humanoid Martians have freed themselves from nearly all forms of coercion, including compulsory labor. Labor is a natural need for the mature member of socialist society, Many explains, making any overt or covert coercion completely superfluous. Initially impressed, Leonid soon realizes that his human foibles will never allow him to fit in among the preternaturally serene, rational, and productive Martians, and may in fact prevent the very cooperation between Earth and Mars he had hoped to facilitate. After a particularly intense bout of fatigue, he decides to seek the counsel of his doctor friend and soon-to-be lover, Nettie. Leonid's visit to her clinic provides Bogdanov with the opportunity to expound on the benefits of blood transfusion. Nettie tells him, rather than occurring only during emergencies or for philanthropic reasons, as on Earth, blood exchanges between older and younger Martians are routine. These comradely exchanges of life not only ensure the participants' longevity and youthfulness, but also metonymically represent the joyful, rationalistic collectivity of the entire Martian order, a renunciation of individualism that Leonid, despite his best efforts, is organically incapable of matching. As Red Star progresses, he finds himself unable to keep up with the Martians' work rhythms and emotionally ill-suited to their lifestyle. His condition worsens after he hears the recorded proceedings of a Martian Congress dedicated to solving the problem of declining natural resources through interplanetary colonization. The coldly rational mathematician Sterney notes that to be successful, a possible Martian colonization of Earth would require the total annihilation of its human inhabitants. His justifications, all perfectly logical, evoke the eugenic thinking of the cosmist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who stipulated that the most merciful way to treat living beings' potential for illness and strife was simply to kill them all. In her spirited rebuttal, Nettie argues that Earth, being closer to the sun than Mars, receives more solar energy and is therefore seething with disorganized life force. The sun's intensive influence, Nettie claims, produces Earthlings' uncontrolled violence and the fragmentation of their societies. Yet it also contributes to the vivaciousness of human cultures, making Earthlings far more heroic and passionate than the phlegmatic Martians. Nettie's analysis implies that if only the respective energetic potentials of Earth and Mars could be conjugated through an energetic transfusion, Earth could benefit from Martian rationalism, while its excess life force could improve Martian science, philosophy, and the arts. Yet Sterney, she concludes, wishes to drain forever this turbulent yet beautiful ocean of life. Like drainage in What is to be Done, energetic channeling is the key to optimal societal organization in Red Star. It is no coincidence that, as Many reveals to Leonid in a lecture on his planet's history, the era in which the Martians dug their canals stimulated great flourishing in all areas of production and a deep lull in the war among classes. Leonid comes to harm not because he is weak, venal, or insufficiently committed to socialist ideals, but precisely because he is incapable of channeling his energies appropriately. The recording of Sterney's speech so enrages him that he murders the mathematician, thereafter falling into a self-loathing so profound he fails to register his possibly compulsory journey back to Earth. His subsequent rescue by Nettie, who arrives just as a new Russian Revolution is accelerating, is tonally ambiguous and no longer narrated by Leonid himself. The novel's ending leaves unclear whether Leonid ever returns to Mars, and if so, what fate awaits him there. By the mid-1920s, Bogdanov stood at the head of Moscow's Institute for Blood Transfusion. This position allowed him to expand upon and bring into practice Red Star's vision of blood transfusion as a means of exchanging knowledge, cementing friendship, and bringing humanity closer to socialist utopia. But even before this point, Bogdanov's thinking had exhibited what Sergei Uteshin called a strong Fyodorovist strain, the idea of overcoming nature's entropic effect on the human body. In a Fyodorov-inflected turn in the early 1920s essay on physiological collectivism, Bogdanov wrote that one person's blood might be capable of almost resurrecting another. The trick for Bogdanov, as for Fyodorov, Gorky, and other early Soviet thinkers, was to deploy human liquidity strategically. The revolutionary significance of the blood transfusion lies in its ability to rupture the boundaries of physiological individuality to support one organism with the life-giving elements of another, deploying unmediated biophysical cooperation in the struggle against destructive spontaneity. What Bogdanov called destructive spontaneity, familiar from a revolutionary discourse that opposed it to the more desirable state of consciousness, Сознательность, threatens the unmediated biophysical cooperation of a virtuous collectivity nourished by a unified circulatory system. By comparison with the dreams of various Fyodorovians, Tolstoyans, God-builders, futurists, and prolet cultists, Bogdanov's scientific imagination of conjugation through blood transfusion hardly stands out as exceptional, yet as the surrounding culture absorbed and adapted them, his ideas revealed their transformative potential. The remarkable congruence of Bogdanovism with early Stalinist policy may be attributed to the rise of what the writer and critic Alexander Gagnos, writing in Novy Mir in 1988, pejoratively called a religious Bolshevism, appealing above all to faith and emotion. For Gagnos, looking back on the Soviet project from the disillusioned perspective of Twilight socialism, the 20s and 30s were characterized by a total biologization of society. Yet in an increasingly biocentric discourse, Gagnos argued the Superman of the future was divested of all living features, transforming into dead abstraction. The irrationalism tinging Bogdanov's beliefs had in fact been one of the causes of his rupture with Lenin. Bogdanov's imperiomonism invoked Ernst Mach and Richard Avenarius to assert that material reality did not exist independently of the observer and his sense perceptions, a position Lenin critiqued as hopelessly naive and anti-materialist. Accusations of unscientific wishful thinking continued to plague Bogdanov through the 1920s and even after his death. His 1927 book, The Struggle for Viability, published at the peak of his career as the director of the Institute of Blood Transfusion, was greeted with a collective yawn from Russia's medical and biological communities. As historian of science, this is like a sad and relatable story, kind of. As historian of science, Nikolai Krementsov recounts, I did not find a single review of his book in any of Russia's numerous biological journals. Apparently, neither Bogdanov himself nor his patrons in Narkomzdrav and the Central Committee paid much attention to the opinions of leading Russian physicians and transfusiologists. After Bogdanov's death in 1928, his successor at the Institute, Alexander Bogomolets, described his ideas as mechanistic, schematic, and hypothetical, quote, a medieval mysticism mixed with the dogma of mechanistic materialism. In one sense, Krementsov writes, Bogdanov's death delivered a fatal blow to his vision of physiological collectivism and to his research program on blood exchanges. But as with Fyodorov, traces of Bogdanov's underlying philosophy remained within Stalinist discourse, animating policy long after his memory was systematically eradicated and even smeared. True, his institute remained Bogdanovist only in name, and even that soon ceased to be the case, with researchers turning from visionary biology to the more practical task of perfecting blood transfusion on the battlefield. Yet his commitment to a proletarian science embodied what would become the socialist realist values of partiyность, ideyность, and narodность/доступность, party-mindedness, ideological commitment, and national spirit or accessibility. Practicality was another of Bogdanov's values, seen also in Fyodorov's and Tolstoy's disdain for overly sophisticated science for science's sake, that became a pillar of Marxist-Leninist-Stalinist thought in the 1930s. The official commitment to practicality was, for instance, a major factor in the rise of Trofim Lysenko and his utterly practical pseudoscience of agrobiology. Lysenko's own favorite research institution, the informal shack laboratory, exemplified Bogdanov's notion of simplified and generalized proletarian science, easily accessible to anyone with or even without some basic education. Finally, Stalinist irrationalism, in the vein of 2 + 2 = 5, represented a return precisely to Bogdanov's understanding of the universe as consisting entirely of the observer's sense perception. Between 1929 and 1935 especially, Stalin's program for the Soviet Union involved forcibly bending empirical phenomena to his own idiosyncratically conceived noumena. Yet as the erasure of extraneous names like Fyodorov, Bogdanov, and many others from the discourse shows, the only observer whose sense perception mattered for Stalinist political practice was Stalin himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for starting us off on a cheery note. Next up, we have Jinyi joining us from Yale. He is an assistant professor of Slavic languages and literatures. His research focuses on Russian modernism, Russo-Chinese literary and cultural relations, late Soviet culture. His book, The Other is the Universal, Fin de siècle, Russian and Chinese Aesthetics is forthcoming in 2024 from Oxford University Press. And today his talk is entitled Perestroika of the Mind, Pavel Gurevich's Marxist Humanism. Take it away, Jinyu. Thank you. Oh, and make sure to turn your mic on.
Hi, thank you for introducing me. And I found this panel is really human, all too human. I will talk about human as well. And this is really raw, a new project, and just begin. I will come to all kind of suggestion, criticism. So in 1985, many things began to change in the Soviet Union. Banned books become gradually available, taboos become trendy. What used to be the undercurrents became the mainstream. In other words, perestroika began. In March 1986, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union held its 27th Congress, the first presided over by Mikhail Gorbachev. During the Congress, delegates passed a revision of the KPSS program, adding languages about political democratization and a humanist ideological orientation. In October, Gorbachev joined the Lake Issyk Forum organized by Chingiz Aytmatov. The Soviet leader had the chance to exchange ideas about the cosmopolitan, all-human future beyond ideological differences and geopolitical interest with cultural celebrities from all around the world, including American playwright Arthur Miller, civil rights activist James Baldwin, futurologist Afwan Tofla, Turkish writer Yashir Kemal, British actor Pyotr Ustinov. Also in October, in Reykjavik, Gorbachev and Reagan announced their plan to reduce nuclear weapons. In 1988, Gorbachev met with the Patriarch Pimen, the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church, for the sake of the millennium of the Christianization of Rus. This was the first meeting between the party leader and the religious leader since 1943. Besides openness and humanism, religion also became appreciated on the ideological front of perestroika. The Soviet Union looked different. Perestroika brought new tasks to Soviet philosophical, ideological professionals, not just those who work in the party organs, for example, like in the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, but also professors and research fellows at the Institute of Philosophy, at Institute of Atheism, at the Academy of Sciences in USSR, as well as their colleagues in other institutions across the country. The politically correct and sacred discursive apparatus, which they have mastered for decades, become obsolete and almost reactionary. The latest change in their country might render papers written 2 months ago outdated before their publication. The philosophical ideological professionals face a major challenge: how to maintain ideological coherence in their writing. On one hand, they need to embrace perestroika, openness, democracy, humanism, and even religious freedom. On the other hand, all the new ideological orientations must align with Marx-Leninist principles. The tricky task of ideological coherence requires delicate maneuvering and genuine philosophical investigation. Here I use the epithet philosophical ideological professionals to refer to the establishment scholar who wrote in line with official policies and guidance instead of apparatchiks, propagandists, ideologues, philosophers, because the later ones either understate or overstate their subjectivity. So my paper today will focus on one of the perestroika era philosophical ideological professionals, Pavel Semyonovich Gurevich, who wrote extensively on humanism from a Marxist perspective. Born in Ulan-Ude, Buryatia in 1933, Gurevich ventured into many fields in his academic career, earning 3 degrees in 3 disciplines. He was a кандидат исторических наук, доктор филологических наук, and доктор философских наук. After graduating from the philological faculty of Ural State University, he first worked as a journalist at Pravda Buryatia, then moved to Moscow to work at the State Committee for Television and Radio of USSR before joining the Institute of Philosophy and at the Academy of Sciences in 1984. Today, Gurevich is more famous as the author of school textbooks on philosophy, psychology, social studies. He also makes public intellectual programs, video programs on topics ranging from psychoanalysis, Russian literature, to the problem of low birth rate and low birth rate and asexuality in the contemporary world. So problematic. What's wrong with young people? Kind of that's one rationale. Though he had worked in state media and sought to reconcile humanist discourse with official Soviet Marxism, It would be unfair to say that he was an opportunist who pivoted to humanism only to follow Gorbachev. Since 1970s, he had been working towards a humanist philosophy. In the 70s, he mainly focused on media theory of Adorno, McLuhan, Enzensberger's, and Fromm, a field called the mass ideological process in Soviet terminology. These studies led to his monograph, The Bourgeois Ideology and Mass Consciousness in 1980. In 1988, Gurevich edited an anthology entitled Problema человека в западной философии, the problem of the person in Western philosophy, where he made many works of crucial Western philosophers available in Russian for the first time, including like Ernest Cassier's An Essay on Man, Max Scheller's The Situation of Man in the Universe, and Martin Heidegger's Letter on Humanism. He also published two other popular science brochures, Humanism of Faith, Humanism, Traditions, and Paradoxes. All of these works on humanism eventually led Gurevich to his doctorskaya, Человек как объект социально-философского анализа, defended in 1991. So in the entire 80s, he's working towards this. Additionally, Gurevich was not the only person interested in, say, philosophical anthropology in late Soviet period. Irina Vidovina, Azad Zykova, Gayane Davrizian, and also Varid Badroga all produced stellar works on this trendy topic since the 1970s. However, it was Gurevich's work that most directly demonstrated this intellectual professional tendency of coming to terms with humanism. In the 1980s, while post-humanism and transhumanism began to thrive in the West, the interest in the philosophy of the human revived in socialist countries and the reform. In China, for example, the interest in Scheller, Cassirer, and Sartre was booming in the 80s, which I will talk comparatively elsewhere. In the summer of 1983, Gurevich attended the World Philosophical Congress in Montreal, where he met Canadian analytic philosopher William Drey. They argue over the origin of humanism. While Drey argued that humanism had manifested in ancient philosophy, Gurevich argued that, quote, Christianity was the soil of the European personalistic tradition in which richness, personality, individuality became understood as the unique shrine and absolute. This point aligned with Gorbachev's recent meeting with the patriarch. It also paved the way for Gurevich's further painstaking efforts to make the new development of the official policy coherent with the principle of atheism and Marxism-Leninism. Drawing on Alexei Losev, Berdyaev, and Karl Jaspers, Gurevich argued that Christianity must be celebrated because it invented the human versus the cosmos binary, while in the Hellenic culture, the human was only part of the cosmos. Gurevich rarely invoked Berdyaev in his early writing. But here in the 1990 brochure, he cited Berdyaev's Человек и машина, the human being and machine, published in the latest issue of Вопросы философии. Gurevich did not attack Soviet atheists' earlier denunciation of religion. Instead, his target was the French New Right, a far-right movement emerged in France in the late 1960s, which viewed Christianity as a religion of slaves. For Gurevich, the French New Right did so because they, unlike the Soviets, did not value individual human rights. The fact that Gurevich used the French New Right as the anti-humanist allowed him to avoid criticizing the Soviet past and imply that it was the reactionary movement in the West that developed Christianity, not the Soviets. Additionally, Gurevich carefully commented on the celebration of religion's role in Soviet society. He only acknowledged Christianity's historical and cultural significance instead of going further than Gorbachev's position. Gorbachev, who said in a speech that religion is not our ideology, the socialist way of life, the scientific worldview. And to do so, Gurevich developed a nationalist rhetoric, calling Gorbachev's meeting with the patriarch a holiday of Russian culture for all of us, the Christians, the secular humanists. Following this state-sanctioned discourse, Gurevich also began to treat atheists and believers as equal counterparts in the Soviet society, no longer casting religion as heresy or detrimental to the official ideology of atheism. But how could this be coherent? Referring to his meeting with theologian Theodor Hasberg on the campus of University of Notre Dame, Gurevich wrote that Hasberg also acknowledged religion as a form of humanism. According to Gurevich, Habsburg's point was that the story of God creating the world in 7 days could be a mythologized narrative of the Big Bang theory, with the Almighty God personifying the enormous energy of explosion. This invocation of the American theologian is apt because in 1988, the Soviet journal Nauka i Religia has also published his work. Gurevich then moved on to a conversation with another theologian, Alexander Rane, who now is the archpriest in Veliki Novgorod, but then was a student at the Leningradskaya Dukhovnaya Akademia. According to Gurevich, Rane believed that perestroika and glasnost address the same concerns as contemporary Christians. If perestroika fits the Christian ideal, does it betray the socialist and atheist agenda? It must not. If Gorbachev could work with the patriarch Bimin, then the two ideologies must be able to coexist harmoniously. For Gurevich, both Christianity and Marxism are forms of humanism, with the latter being a more scientific and applicable form. For Gurevich, humanist Marxism is the true face of Marxism. Not only did some Westerners misunderstand the Soviet project, but many Soviets also misinterpreted Marx in the last few decades. In a conversation with Australian philosopher John Passmore in 1988, Gurevich said that Marx's true legacy has not been fully appreciated. For Gurevich, Marx's single most contribution is the discovery of history as the humanization of the human being, the человечевание. Enter capitalism, a human being is only partially human, because the capitalist exploitation and oppression alienated and objectified human labor. Human beings work not for the development of their own humanity, but for survival. Under socialism, one should not feel the same way. If people do feel the same way, then the state leaders must not run the socialism, correctly, thus necessitating a perestroika. Perestroika sets humanism as its fundamental ideology and allow a pluralism of beliefs precisely because this socialist project aimed at the full development of humanity, which is a Marxist doctrine. Though very careful with his rhetoric, Gurevich was also frank about his concern. He openly criticized the problems in economic and industrial reforms. He wrote that while the GBS's program has filled with a humanist spirit, the last 4 years has not produced satisfactory result. He argued that the true revival of humanism should be in social practice. If humanism is a universal value, then Marxism must be part of this tradition. To portray a humanist Marx, Gurevich frequently referred to Marx's doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and the economic and philosophic manuscript of 1844 and the sixth thesis on Feuerbach. These three pieces are Marx's major writings on human nature, where Marx argued that humanity is shaped by the totality of social relations and not as embodiment of the permanent, universal, and transcendental spirit. By portraying this humanist Marx, Gurevich argued against the popular school of thought that Marx was the anti-humanist economist, an image mainly drawn from the Communist Manifesto and some chapters of The Capital. Though the early works of Marx are critical of idealist philosophy, as Gurevich maintained, they still share the German idealist celebration of the uniqueness of humankind. Gurevich's emphasis on Marx's early works is vital because it shows that the ideological origin of the Soviet project is deeply rooted in the humanist tradition instead of merely political economy, as many Westerners, even well-educated non-Marxist philosophers assumed. By starting one of his chapters with the latest event, the Iseguo Forum, Gurevich linked it back to the foundation of the Soviet Union, saying that the Soviet state was closely tied to the universal human interest from the very beginning. Among both Western and Soviet Marxists, referencing the economic and philosophical manuscript of 1844 was commonplace. Since the discovery of the manuscript in the Soviet Union in 1933, Marxists began to recalibrate their views. Some celebrated humanism in young Marx, for example, in Lukács, Sartre, and Deman, and others preferred the older, more mature Marx, for example, like Louis Althusser. Despite their disagreement, all acknowledged the division between the young Marx and the older Marx. In contrast, Gurevich intentionally omitted this heated theoretical debate as if there were no polemics over this issue. Even academic Fyodor Konstantinov, the author of the authoritative philosophical textbook, acknowledged this division. As a well-trained Soviet philosophical ideological professional who worked directly under the leadership of Konstantinov, Gurevich must have been aware of this common understanding. However, it seems that the intentional omission of this division may have better facilitated Gorbachev's cosmopolitan and humanist position. Before Gorbachev, Soviet discourse never completely avoided using the human in their official statement. But it was only in 1986 revision of the GABA-SS program that humanism became emphasized. Even in the 1961 Khrushchev version, the program used the human and humanism only 4 times, and only to describe the moral standard of party members, together with collectivism and labor-loving. In Brezhnev era, of course, as we know, the Prague Spring socialism with a human face was considered reactionary and must be oppressed. In 1986, however, the usage of humanism in this program doubled. Socialism became described as a society in the name of people and for the interest of people. Chilavik here. In the revised party program, humanists become the adjective modifying Marxist-Leninist ideology. Gurevich's writing can be viewed as a direct advancement of this spirit. Gurevich's humanist interpretation may stem directly from German-American philosopher Erich Fromm. It was Fromm who claimed that there was no need to split Marx into two, and that ideas of the older Marx must not undergo a basic change. The influence is not incidental, as Gurevich has been working on Fromm since the late 1970s and edited 8 volumes of the Russian translation of Fromm's work. In 1961, Fromm prefaced the English translation of Marx's economic philosophical manuscript of 1844. In this preface, Marx's concept of man is arguably the most straightforward humanist defense of Marx. In this piece, Fromm critiqued American ignorance and the demonization of Marxism, as well as the Soviet vulgarization of Marxism. For Fromm, an ardent critic of the Stalinist regime, he says that it was the Russian communists who split Marx because they can hardly do anything else, since their thinking as well their action in their social and political system in every way a contradiction to Marxist humanism. Obviously, though Gurevich embraced Fromm's humanist interpretation of Marx, he had to neglect anti-Soviet discourse. While Fromm's task was to rescue Marx from the Soviet falsifications and that hindered many Western readers from understanding the real Marx, Gurevich had to justify Perestroika project without fully delegitimizing the Soviet regime. Reconciling Marxism and humanism was not just Gurevich's personal research interest, but also an ideological foundation of Perestroika. This process led him to the deeper philosophical investigations. The ideological agenda of Perestroika is that if socialism is to be the full emancipation of humanism, then it must inherently be humanist. Conversely, it is not in genuine humanism if it conflicts with socialist principle. As a thinker of his time, Gurevich represents imperative to renegotiate the existing Marxist discourse with Western humanism. His writing embodies a peculiar aesthetic of reform. Thanks.
Thank you, Jinyi, for that presentation. And now we'll turn things over to our discussant, our very own Jessica Merrill, who's an associate professor of Slavic languages here at Columbia, a scholar of 20th century Russian literature, and a specialist in the fields of Russian and Czech literary theory, folklore, and Russian and Czech modernisms. Her first book, The Origins of Russian Literary Theory, Folklore, Philology, and Form, from Northwestern University Press, is an intellectual history that reconstructs context for thinking about literary form from the 1840s to the 1950s, reinterpreting central Russian formalist concepts and revealing the lost paths in the history of literary theory. Her current book project, Circling in Time and Space, Modern Temporalities, and the Narration of Experience, brings together research on the history of Russian literature, narrative theory, and folklore studies, examining a particular narrative chronotope, cyclical time and bounded space, to articulate the experience of time in several case studies. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Vinny. Thank you. And thank you to Valeria for inviting me to be part of this conference today. So I will simply, in order to make sure that there's more time for discussions, open the conversation with a couple of questions for these two very interesting papers that we've just heard. I'll go in order and start with Maya's paper, which does a very interesting insight into thinking about the period of the 20s and 30s through this metaphor of liquidic movements or energetics, the sort of discourse of energetic channeling, which she argues informs Stalinist labor culture via inherited thought of a range of thinkers. Right, we heard about Fyodorov, Tsiolkovsky, Gorky, Bogdanov, and also Tolstoy. Is an important piece of this picture. And so I have basically just two questions. One is to invite you to contextualize this discourse of energetic channeling in relation to, I suppose, scientific discourses of the time. And so I'll, suggest a couple that might be interesting for us to hear about how this notion of channeling contrasts, I suppose, with either Darwinian evolution, with study of thermodynamics in physics, possibly, or Marxist philosophies of history, right? And I guess what I'm interested in is the way in which this notion of the collective as a system is imagined to evolve over time, right? If that is a way of right, so the diachronic aspect of this notion of people as forming a kind of system of energy flows. And then the second question, you referenced the biopolitics, high Stalinist biopolitics, and the way in which this discourse sort of flows maybe underneath the radar, to mix my metaphors, into the 30s. And I was wondering if your project goes into detail in the actual, I guess, implementation of biopolitics in the 30s and beyond, such as, you talk about Bogdanov's Institute of Blood Transfusion, but what other sort of medical institutes or political practices, medical policies of biopolitics might be impacted or not by this notion of the individual as a kind of flow of energy or a particle within a larger system that is responsible for its health in some way. And my questions for Ginny, thank you very much for your paper. I found this quite interesting to think about. My questions, you mentioned the sort of Czechoslovak Dubček's formulation of socialism with the human face, to say that it, mentioned that it was rejected as kind of heterodox in the 1970s. But my question was, about the sources of this turn to humanism among Marxist thinkers in the 80s. So what are some of the, other than going back to Marx and the reading of Fromm that you mentioned, is there a reevaluation of earlier reform movements in Czechoslovakia or Poland or Hungary, or maybe also to invite you to talk a little bit more, as you hinted at, about the parallel interest in humanism in China in the 1980s. So some of the bigger picture. I guess second question is maybe to clarify for me, or maybe others have a similar question about the place of religious thought and Christian humanism. What I suppose motivates or necessitates this kind of revival of Christian or Christian even nationalist thought in the perestroika context. And finally, third question, just to hear a bit about you mentioned this was part of a larger project, I think. What this why have you chosen Gurevich, and what does a sort of study of his thought reveal to us about perestroika, which we didn't understand before? So, I don't know how we want to
Yeah,
do this.
and could we pass the mic between the presenters and give them a chance to respond before we open things up to the floor?
Sure. Jeannie, do you want me to go? I can start. Okay. So I took some notes, Jessica, but feel free to, like, we can make this more discursive if you want. So the first thing, contextualizing the discourse of energy channeling within like contemporary scientific movements. I think thermodynamics is a really important context to think about because of the idea that energy is neither created nor destroyed, which creates, like in its, I guess, popular manifestation, it creates this idea that all possible energies are in a zero-sum balance, and therefore already in the 1920s, we see, this actually also kind of gets at your second question about the like evolution of these discourses over time. There's a lot of concern about exhaustion of energy, like exhaustion among like high-ranking party members, and like how can they do their important work if they're so tired, and like what are methods for rejuvenating or replenishing energies. So this idea that, and also the idea that if you spend your energy in the wrong way, in the wrong place, then you won't have it for like the construction of socialism. And this creates all sorts of programs and ideas, and they have, I don't know, there's like if you think about a work like Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, right? The context for that narrative is precisely this idea that like sexual energy is finite. If you expend it in youth, then you have to have a monkey gland transplantation later in life to prevent yourself from being impotent, and so on and so forth. But then this easily carries over into how labor is conceptualized, and that's where at first you get all of this like scientific management discourse. If energy is finite, if it's all our energies are in a zero-sum balance, then there needs to be, we have to optimize. And this is, by the way, where I see a lot of commonality between like Stalinist or even early Soviet schemes for optimization and like just optimization more generally as a practice. It's all about how do you best conduct yourself in the workplace at the factory, for example, so that you don't waste all of your energy in needless movements and you can focus as much of it as possible on the task, the specific labor task before you. And that has a lot of implications for how, like paradoxically, the more attention is paid to this idea, the less attention is paid to like issues like exhaustion, and the idea that human raw material is not actually fungible, and that like once a person is dead, that's kind of it. So somehow these contradictory discourses manage to mesh together in a more or less coherent way. I think there's more to be said about this in different ways, but I don't want to pass it over to Jeannie.
Yeah, thank you, Jess, for all these questions. The first is about kind of the bigger picture of different interpretations, because there's a lot of kind of contradictory, there are internal conflicts among leaders, socialist leaders, and they're changing over time. And I'm in the process of going through a lot of the historical piece of this. But so far what I gather, this was beginning the early 80s until the mid 80s. I mean, there are already a lot of things going on before Gorbachev, but say since 84, there are reevaluations with kind of within the Communist Party about the different models of socialism in Poland and Yugoslavia, which they more criticize about, but they're kind of really re-evaluating that. And there are different documents suggesting they haven't really fully made up their mind. Some that are published, some that are unpublished. And also with kind of, because the Chinese reforms started a few years earlier, and they're seeing good results, and there are also ideas about, okay, maybe we do something similar and adopting some things. So there are different ideas about this. So and the changes happen really fast. Every few weeks, month, and you will see a completely different rhetoric. So that's kind of a really delicate time and for people. That's the first question. And about religion. Yes, well, that was the time when religion becomes more. So first is like more religious activities become allowed, and also the earlier kind of censored religious philosophy become all of a sudden boom time, and more visibly after the collapse of Soviet Union. But like a few years before that, it all become published. And I found Gurevich was like he's very careful, and he's not like a dissident at all, or anyway he follows the mainstream discourse very carefully, and as I mentioned, that he just whenever there's a new available material from non-traditional sources, he's only using them after they're allowed to use, and that makes me interesting to me, because I try to understand how kind of can I use this term like philosophical ideological professionals, because I treat them as professionals in a way that they need to write in a certain way that in line with the state in order to maintain the ideological coherence. It has to be coherent, and so that makes him interesting. And but I do find the later. I mean, Gurevich just nobody. I maybe anybody personally know him. I don't. I don't think he's definitely not a first-rate philosopher anyway. It's very no, not at all. That made me interesting to me, and because he calculates the way to write, and that makes him more representative of a community of writer professional scholars, kind of mediocre scholars. So he's more representative than amazing thinkers.
Right.
So the larger picture is this. So I'm trying to start a new project, which is a study of both Chinese and Soviet perestroika culture, in order to see that, to me, it's like the perestroika/reform or 改革 in China is imagined as a optimizing effort of socialism instead of departing from it. Because, well, actually turning to capitalism is quite easy. You just become decadent. There's no struggle. The internal struggle of perestroika is because you try to optimize the Soviet project, right? And how to do so is hard. And to optimize this involves, of course, a lot of the new cultural productions and economic reforms. But in ideological front is to maintain ideological coherence. And if I pick a case, say, Birtaev, he doesn't care about ideological coherence of communism. He is going to tell you now it's not coherent. But for a figure like Gurevich, he tries to maintain the coherence, even though sometimes what he wrote 2 years ago is completely contradictory to his scholarly output after a few years. It's in the writing of this kind of people, you can see their effort of making sense of this. But I find that in the 80s he's still more interesting. In 2000 he just become weird, like many people, just lecturing on TV about the problems of become grumpy, basically.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I'm really happy to respond myself, but I will refrain.
Yeah, and I think we already have a question from the audience.
Thank you for those fascinating and brilliant interventions. And I've really appreciated how the two papers were actually in a very interesting dialogue, even though dealing with different historical periods. There are these echoes at historical periods where the key terms become really important. What do we mean by capitalism? What do we mean by socialism? What do we mean by communism? Who's defining? And I think it's important because, Maya, as you point out, rightfully, there is an interesting parallel between these energy flows that you're identifying and, say, Taylor's principles of scientific management, I think because both deal with the extraction of surplus value. So if that's the goal, isn't what was happening then in the Soviet Union, state capitalism, right? And new economic policy was, that kind of was what it was, right? We're going to have a little bit of free market under state control. And I'm thinking also about perestroika. Why was it so important for them to reevaluate humanist Marx, even though we're moving toward capitalism? So I wonder if you can identify your key terms. Sorry to sound professorial, but if when you're using these terms in your own writing, are you defining it in your own words? Are you going to Marx and trying to reinterpret Marx in your own words to say, okay, this is what we mean by socialism. Actually, what was happening under the Soviet Union was not socialism, because globally, we still have a capitalist system. So it's going to fail no matter what, because that global capital system is going to be pushing against that. And of course, the example of China is really interesting in that discourse, because I think the big debate is, what kind of economic system is that? Is it still capitalism or something else? So I wonder if you could address that.
Thanks. The microphone. So I guess for me, it was never, the most important thing was how the figures in the discourses, I guess, thought of and defined themselves. So like, someone like Bogdanov would be super surprised if to not be classed among socialists or communists, right? So what's interesting to me is the way in which actually all of those ideas become divorced from their labels and evolve in a direction that is seemingly at odds with their nominal goals. And actually, like, that is the, I guess, the crux of the problem that I'm examining. Like, it kind of doesn't matter what they called themselves, because we can notice, liberating, or myself, I guess, from concern with labels lets me see common threads where maybe otherwise they would elude me. So I think we can take it seriously that all these people like read Marx and were sincerely attempting to fashion a society based on Marxist principles, and at the same time we can look at the actual, like the 2 + 2 = 5 logic, and understand that like it's possible to, the interesting thing is that it's possible to both call that like extremely scientific and technologically based, and then to have a poster that says 2 + 2 = 5, right?
So the question to me first is like, what is capitalism? What is socialism? So let's begin from that. I mean, it's a tricky question, right? And how do we use them? Because we use them, we know we were talking about, we will never define them. And this is the struggle that faced by people in the epistemic era as well. But let's, before we get into the specific definition of what is not, but they also means different things in different contexts. And here, when we talk about socialism, we're talking about, first of all, a state regime. A state regime based on a certain social formation of political economy, right? If you take a very traditional kind of Marxist framework, is that from slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. So they're defined by different kind of production of relations of production. In that sense, without specifying, is based on the whether, so who owns the means of production defines capitalism versus socialism, right? But these are vague terms. I mean, even to Marxist philosophers, to Marx and Engels and to Lenin, all of them, is the later generation who runs many socialist economy. They also tries to reinterpret it, how we define those things. Because if you want to be a real Marxist, you have to develop, you have to move forward instead of being dogmatic, right? So that is the philosophical, ideological tasks of these people, to reinterpret this and develop Marxism in a sense, and not just the Soviet Marxists, but also other famous Western Marxists did this as well, right? You have a new theory of surplus value, new theory of different kinds of, like Donald Benjamin, the Frankfurt School. They're all try to doing this, and they disagree. Even contemporary American thinkers as well. There's a lot of disagreements. But in general, here, when I use it, I'm talking about social formation and relations of production. There's another question, I think. Did I answer all the questions? Okay, good.
Hi, thanks so much for these really excellent papers. I also felt like there was a lot of correspondence between the two. They were in dialogue with one another. I had a question for each of the panelists individually. Maya, some of the narrative I hear you tracing is one in which early socialist utopianism becomes a precursor to a dystopian Stalinism. And my question then is, what about other models for utopianism that exist that rely on some of the texts that you use? And I'm thinking here particularly of, and I give away my own departmental formation here, Frederick Jameson's work in The Seeds of Time, and also his concept of world reductionism, which builds on Ursula Le Guin novels. And in The Seeds of Time, Jameson suggests that a text like Platonov's Jivingur, in which everyone dies, in which, of course, the emphasis on Fyodorov is there, and you mentioned this in your own presentation, is actually a utopian model. And one in which utopianism is here not conceived as the production of the better world in the terms that the current world would think of it, but the better world that comes outside the space of what is currently imaginable, such that the present world has to be reduced to nothing in order to make space for a new imaginary. And I wonder then about whether the story here is one in which, or how that kind of a thought might engage with what you're saying about the relationship between socialist utopianism and Stalinist dystopianism. My question for Jinyi has to do with Fromm. And you mentioned psychoanalysis very briefly in your discussion of, I'm sorry, the name is escaping me, Gurevich. What is interesting to me is that Fromm is so much a Freudo-Marxist coming out of the Frankfurt School. And for Fromm, analytic social psychology should seek to understand unconsciously motivated behavior in terms of how socioeconomic substructure impacts psychical drives. So I'm wondering here if what Gurevich's humanism you're describing is actually something coming out of a Freudo-Marxist framework in which the human is reframed through an attempt to integrate psychoanalytic concepts of the drives into a historical materialism. And if you could speak to that relationship between psychoanalysis and the history of psychoanalysis and Marxism and what Gurevich is doing, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Kate. I think actually, like ultimately, this is not dissimilar to Elisa's question in that we're finding ourselves again at sort of like a terminological conflict in a way. But I guess the whole thing that's and something I wanted to add on to like the previous segment of discussion is that it makes sense that the moment of state formation and also the moment of state disintegration at the end of the Soviet period, like these are moments in which terminology comes to be hotly disputed because it's like never more important than when everything is like trying to coalesce or about to completely fall apart. So it makes sense that like these would be moments where basic terms like socialism, capitalism come into question. With respect to utopia and dystopia, I would say that like precisely what you're saying is actually going on. Namely, like when Fyodorov imagines, like Fyodorov's utopia, for example, is, I mean, I would say it's like objectively horrifying, right? It definitely represents it's like I don't know, it's like a phantasmagoria of horrors. It's very gothic. Everyone who is dead comes back to life and they're like physically reassembled into, I guess, weird asexual zombies who exist in a state of perpetual childhood, and they're all brothers. And we have to go into space, which is scary. If we think about Fyodorov's ideal urban planning project, the cemetery is at the center because that is the way that we are. It's like the best scenario of all is if we're all like living in the cemetery because then we're closest to our ancestors that way. So it's in a like is that utopia? In this, I guess it's no place. So yes, but also it's awful. And so I think that what happens in the Soviet period is precisely this effort to first take an objectively horrible and broken down reality and present it as being in the process of becoming something great, and then to basically continue to do that all the way until the end. And that is why, you know, you get things like socialist realism. I mean, this is what Dabryanka says about socialist realism, that it's like, socialist realism is the tool for producing socialism. If you are looking for utopia, like, look no further. So I would say that definitional conflict, even though it's most active in these two periods of formation and disintegration, it's really happening kind of all along, and it expresses itself. It's like a constant, I guess, dialectical struggle to present the what's there as what we wanted, and to at the same time give the impression of constant change for the better, right?
And thank you for the question. This is exactly something I try to sort out at the moment. I was reading more Gurevich. It's like, because if you only read, say, one brochure written by him, you will guess probably, for example, the question, the kind of the more Freudian attempt of rescuing the human in a lot of the Marxist interpretation of Marx, what will happen to him? But then you trace his kind of scholarship and life career, life trajectory, and you see that did happen. So I'm in the process of finding all kind of related publications, small articles written by Gurevich and his kind of editorial work, and see what he did. Because he was at the same time also, in 90s, he began publish more on Freud and other psychoanalytics. And he write just, school, like textbook. I don't know why, like maybe like 11th grade need to read much psychoanalysis, but he did. He published, he published so much, and also usually not very good. So it's hard kind of to sorting out his material. But I see a consistence. Even though society is changing drastically around 1991, and he is also always following the latest ideological trend, but there's a strong consistency in his scholarship from the 70s to early 2000. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for the question, yeah.
Thank you for papers, wonderful papers. I also have questions for both Maya and Gino. Maya, you briefly touched upon sort of weird utopia of Fedorov, but what puzzles me every time I read about him or hear about him is that he is so much popular among sort of people who were dreaming about the future, while for him future is completely absent, right? He completely erases future. And so speaking about liquids, and pardon my French, so one liquid that is completely excluded from his vision is sperm, right? It's not to be used at all. And his entire pathos directed against sexuality, right? Against culture focused on sexuality, glorifying sexuality, is also very much sort of counterintuitive in the context of early Soviet culture, especially, right? In the late Soviet culture, yes, it is. But in the early Soviet culture, it's strangely out of place. How do you explain this strange marriage? And for Gino, thank you for bringing up this philosopher. I looked up the Wikipedia page, and indeed he makes huge career in psychoanalysis after 91. He becomes the most prominent psychoanalytic in Russia. He creates this Academy of Psychoanalysis, and so he is the post-Soviet Freud that nobody knows. Going back to your presentation, as far as I understand, this strange and at times sort of clumsy dance that you described by Gurevich, of course, is an attempt to fill or sort of to fix fading Marxism, right? But it was not. Definitely, it was not the only dance to be performed at that moment, right? And Gurevich as far as I can, correct me if I'm wrong, right, was sort of counterdancing it vis-a-vis those who were trying to fix Marxism by nationalism and sort of outright fascism. Can you please speak about this contextual relationship, okay?
You know, when Lera invited me coming here, and there was, I know, I mean, I thought, you know, I will ask you a lot of questions about, especially he studied in Ural. So yeah, maybe you can help me access some interesting materials of him. Exactly, I mean, reading his work, I find that he's dealing with some unspecified enemies. You know, his colleagues, some of his colleagues, as you said, I mean, he's trying to fix defeating Marxism from a humanist point of view. And there are others are kind of more conservatives, sticking to the older doctrines, seek to fix in different ways. And when I read his work, I find that he's dealing with, without specifying, without directly pointing out, this person is bad, this person is good. That's why I find that his reference to the French far right is very interesting, because he's taking a worse enemy, saying that if you're doing the same thing, then you'll become the French far right. And since you're a Soviet Marxist, you shouldn't be that bad. That he's indicating that. And another interesting things I found, also a problem I haven't solved, is that I mentioned the two brochures. One is called Humanism и Вера. The other one, this one is in Russian. The other one's in English. Humanism, Traditions and Paradoxes. The later one is published only in English. And these two books, there are a lot of verbatims in these two books, but also very different. They're both the same book, but also not the same book. The Russian one is more harsh than the English one. The English one can read as just a sheer kind of propaganda brochure, because it's very positive. But for example, if you compare the two versions, this is the same paragraph. And then in the English one, there's disappeared some paragraph. But if you keep reading the Russian, he began to become nasty on some people and there's more celebration of religion. And in the English one, there's more defend of the Soviet project. I don't know why. I haven't figured out the kind of the publishing procedures of Novosti publisher in the late 80s and how these things are issued and based on what. Yeah, so yeah, this is also mystery to me. I realize these two books are almost the same book only because I think they published around the same time, and I checked them both out, and I realized that there are a lot of verbatim. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark, for the question about Fedorov. I would say that the situation with him is fairly ambiguous, because it's true. On the one hand, he imagines a future in which basically human reproduction ceases, because everyone is more or less identical at the same stage of life. Effectively, time stops. But the problem for Fedorov is that we have to get there, and the way to get there is completely future-oriented. Because what is the common task other than a huge mobilizational campaign? I mean, he literally, if you actually read him, it's very urgent. It's very like we should all just drop everything right now, and everything that we do from now on should be toward this resurrectionary moment. It's Christianity, right? Like we're aiming toward a telos of salvation. And so even though he imagines the past returning and everything being in a state of stasis, the impulse toward activity and this mobilizational cant of his writing is impossible to ignore, and it clearly inspired a lot of people. I mean, from the people who thought that they were his followers, the biocosmists, to contemporary Fedorov followers who are all about cryogenics and all about sort of preserving things for the future. But the other aspect of this is that in some ways, Stalinist culture also Nazi culture is a death cult. And so it's not really surprise. It's all about exhaustion of human raw material. It's all about like squeezing things out to the maximum. Look at a narrative like How the Steel Was Tempered, where on the one hand, it's like a Bildungsroman. On the other hand, it's sort of a salvation narrative, but it's also the story of a body disintegrating and eventually dying. So that's also, it's supposed to be an inspirational tale for the young communist, but in the end, it's about how a guy is tired and dies. So it's sorry?
Dies happy.
Dies happy. Well, sure, he dies happy. But so it's always a question, right? Like with all of Soviet ideology, how do you reconcile the obvious insane death drive with the future-oriented cosmic or not cosmic ambition?
He died happy because all his time and energy are dedicated to the most beautiful project in the world.
Precisely.
Emancipation of the human being.
That's right.
Thank you very much for, is it okay to still ask questions? Thank you very much for wonderful papers. I have questions for both of you. My question is very simple, quite like formal, I would say, sort of morphological, not semantic at all. So I'm interested in what happens to the direction of the flow, because with Bogdanov, right, it's an exchange. So the flow has to be going both ways. And I'm wondering what happens with the flow once it gets translated into Stalinist, Stalinist labor or aesthetics and so forth. So that's my question number one. Also, something interesting with Bogdanov, to me, is this kind of desire to go beyond figurative language completely, right? Like he wants to literalize the metaphor. He wants physiological collectivism, and he's thinking how to actually bodily achieve it. And doesn't it become more and more abstract once you kind of get to Stalin? And I mean, this is probably arguable, but I'll leave it for you to talk about that. And Jeannie, thank you so much. I have a question about how Gurevich approached the various critiques of humanism, right? So, for example, you were saying that he was reading Berdyaev. Berdyaev was trying to make a distinction between Western humanism, which he was critiquing, and Christian humanism, which he didn't even call humanism, but he used the word человечность for it, right? So did Gurevich at all acknowledge the fact that there was this whole tradition of of the critique of humanism
Yeah, I really like this question about like what happens to the circular flows in Stalinism. I haven't really thought about it, but I guess if we imagine Stalin as the head of the great family of like all the peoples who are friends with each other, then like a really simplistic answer is that the conjugation is happening like with him, right? That like, or with the state maybe, the state at the head, the state as the receiver of all of the energies, whether it feeds them back in a circular fashion isn't known, I guess, or it's arguable. But the other thing is that if we think about like, I don't know, industrialization era projects of like canal building and like rechanneling waterways and so on, I don't know if that's a circular movement anymore, if it becomes more entropic, right? Maybe we can think about Vladimir Paperny's model of like culture one, culture two, flowing outward versus verticality. Sorry, there was a second part to your question, if you could remind me. Oh, literalization of metaphor. Yeah, I mean, I think that actually does keep happening, and that's sort of the problem. Like if you look at the texts of Stalinist industrialization, partly because of a lack of sophisticated machinery, Like one of my big examples in the book is the White Sea Baltic Canal project, where humans are there instead of machines, right? So it's everything is happening on the level of literalization of metaphor almost. So and again, like this is another thing that is in tension with itself, a tendency toward greater and greater abstraction, greater and greater distance of representation from reality, and at the same time, it is the literalization of metaphor. All the things that were theoretical in the 19th century, all the like Fourierist imaginations, suddenly all become put into practice in particular ways, right?
Thank you, Yulia. But I think this is a question I should address more as well, I mean, in my further writing. And I mentioned that there's some discrepancies between the two versions of this, almost the same book. And what I found is that in the Russian version, he has less critique about the critique of humanism. He's more like you have to think this way, and Marxism and Socialist Project try to come to terms with these two things that some people think they're contradictory. While in the English version, there's more languages about the problems of the humanist beliefs popular in the West. Basically, the point is Western countries don't practice humanism correctly, and Christianity cannot solve everything, even though the origin of that lies in Christianity. And Western countries don't do Christianity even correctly. So it's more like that. But the serious, I mean, today I'm mainly drawing on the two kind of the научно популярные brochures. I need to spend more time in his serious philosophy papers, more like the real Nauka papers, to see how he deal with this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So thanks for the great papers. This is sort of an elementary question, but it's been growing as you've been discussing. The 2 + 2 = 5, of course, made me think about rationalism and Dostoevsky. And so I'm wondering about what happens to the rational here, particularly in light of the conference theme. Is it infinitely flexible? Does the paradigm of science actually still hold any sway in any of the case studies that we're discussing? And this idea of, I think, Jeannie, you said this struggle to sort of keep a party line while also maintaining this intellectual coherence. Kind of, what's the benchmark for coherence for a standard of rationality here?
I guess the common question is how to be rational.
Yeah, sure. I can start. Yeah, I mean, the answer is that basically, at least in the 30s, rationality falls out of style, right? Like this is I mean, already in the end of the 20s, we have the like so-called specialist baiting, right? Like the de-emphasis. Basically, if you attempt to be rational in the sense of adhering to plans and norms and calculations, this is problematic because it doesn't allow for the appropriate level of, I guess, faith in the project and the appropriate level of commitment. So even though, and again, there is at the root of this is basically another terminological dispute, namely, like, what do we refer to as like, is it more rational to continue to do socialist competition and like emphasize quantity over quality and like meet a certain norm, or is it more rational to like take a look at what certain machinery can withstand and base our production quotas on that? And it turns out that like that's the wrong approach. That's sabotage, right? So I would say in the 30s, particularly in the early 30s, and maybe in the later 30s too, there's a sense of like limitlessness, an extra or super rational limitlessness, and it comes to govern pretty much everything that's happening in society. Which also gives that period its character of sort of like adventurism and heroicism, But it has nothing to do with rationality in the sense of like doing a calculation and then sticking to it, I would say.
Thank you, Chloe. I guess your question is like, what's the point of maintaining this coherence, right? It should be rational, right? How about let's just be crazy and and I think this. So in a way, I'm personally, I mean, this is kind of how you when you looking at the subject you study, I'm sympathetic of these kind of researchers, because it's one of their job is to maintain this coherence, to produce the writing that legitimize and rationalize some seemingly contradictory things, because the society is moving forward, having changes, and so like, yeah, why the state pays your salaries? This is your job. It's just to whatever you do, you rationalize it, and it's a very hard job. And I do think this is partly is you think you treat it as a job, and also if in a way that as a genuine Marxist, you also care about the result of this, and they must be coherent. Otherwise, that undermines the state, right? And also there are also the kind of writing from different camps, social ideological camps, both in the West and within kind of Russian language writing, try to attack the Soviet state. And from their position is that their job is to make sense of what's going on. Actually, this is more challenging for them. And as, for example, as Mark earlier mentioned, there are other philosophers, I should not use the word philosopher, professionals, to offer different rationalizations, which may be a slightly weaker rationalization than his one, or maybe stronger. But, that's what they're doing. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, Tanya, if you want. Yeah.
I have a quick question for Maya. You showed us this fantastic picture of Lenin, Fedorov, and Gorky. Lenin dies in 1924. I was wondering whether the project of the preservation of his body was in any direct connection to the scientific ideas that you've been exploring conceptually or scientifically, and whether you see a connection between the idea of biopolitics and sovereignty under Stalin to any of the ideas that were developed by Fedorov and Bogdanov.
Yeah, so as you know, there was a huge debate about what to do with Lenin's body after he died. It was not at all clear that the result of the debate would be to like embalm him forever and preserve him in a mausoleum. I can't remember like the exact allegiances and alliances within the ranks of the debaters, or whether Fedorov was mentioned, but it does make sense, right? It's like a very Fedorov type thing to do, and especially the idea of sort of like constructing the capital of the empire around effectively like a mausoleum, a cemetery, also makes a lot of sense. So I think it's kind of like it's a very Fedorov-esque beginning to this like new period of Soviet history that starts after Lenin dies, I would say. And then we also have to think about the fact that here I'm just cribbing freely from Yurchak's article, Bodies of Lenin, from several decades ago now, where he talks about how by now Lenin's body is like 0% of it is the original body, because of all of the basically piece by piece, it's been replaced over the last like 100 years until it is the ancestral particles are no longer present, basically. So that we can ask a question about how, maybe Lenin's body is, even though it's more preserved than ever before, it's maybe less in line with Fyodorov's ideas, because it's just like bits of, I don't know, it's like microplastic beads or something. All right.
And with that, let us wrap up this session. May your utopias be protocolled and your protocols be utopian. Thank you to the presenters.
Thank you so much.